Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Chapter 16, Rafat.
We have seen, in an earlier chapter, that throughout the campaign in Palestine, the left British flank, near the sea, was at all times much in advance of the right. We have already discussed the cause and advantages. There was one distinct disadvantage. As the trend of the country sloped up from the maritime plain, the enemy on our right front was on higher ground and had the advantages of observation. If there were a commanding position to our front, and we moved forward and captured it, we found that there were yet other positions beyond, from which that position was itself commanded. Our positions on the Ephraim Mountains along the Bullet Ridge were at this time overlooked from three commanding hills in the possession of the enemy, known as Arara, Rafat, and Three Bushes. Further to the right were the villages of El Kep and Barukin, also on high ground. Owing to the conformation of the country, the key of this district was Arara. In order to improve the general line, and in preparation for a further advance, it was decided to move forward and to capture all these commanding positions. Accordingly, on the morning of the 9th April, the line moved forward. The village of El Kep was a nest of machine guns. After heavy bombardment, it was captured after stubborn resistance. Barukin was also captured after sharp fighting, but further progress in this locality was held up. Next day, these villages were heavily counterattacked, and though they were firmly held, further progress was out of the question. Meanwhile, a battalion of Somersets had captured Rafat, and a battalion of Dorset's Three Bushes Hill. Enemy shelling now became intense, followed up by counterattacks, all of which were repulsed. The intention had been that the Somersets should capture Rafat first and then take Arara, the main objective of these operations. The capture of Three Bushes Hill was necessary to secure Arara and Rafat from reverse fire, but to enable Arara to be held, it was also necessary to capture other heights to the southeast, notably one called the Pimple. Most of these heights were captured, but, although determined efforts were made, the enemy could not be dislodged from the Pimple. Nevertheless, the Somersets moved forward from Rafat and successfully established themselves upon Arara. Here they were fired at from all sides. They found that Arara was itself commanded from a height called Sheikh Silba, 1,000 or 2 yards beyond, while the reserve fire from the machine guns on the Pimple soon made their position on Arara untenable. They fell back upon and firmly established themselves in their positions at Rafat. One lad, who was left behind in this retirement, had a terrible experience. Wounded in 3 or 4 places, he was unable to withdraw with the remainder of his company. He lay out on Arara for 3 days, after which he was discovered by some Turks. These proceeded to strip him, whereupon he made known to them that he was still alive. They then bayoneted him and left him for dead. He lay out there for yet another day, now naked, when he was found by a German stretcher party. These took pity upon him and removed him to a hospital, where he was nursed back to life. The position on Three Bushes Hill had become interesting. If left in our undisputed possession, it would have rendered the main line of enemy trenches untenable. On the other hand, if the enemy could drive us off, he might from there roll up Rafat and our other positions. He therefore made several determined attempts throughout the day to retake this hill. The position was not altogether unlike that on Spionkop. Each side clung to the slope immediately below the summit, the forward slope being untenable through shell fire. Our guns were unable to silence the hostile batteries. There was this difference, however, from Spionkop, for here there was no question at present of withdrawing. The difficulties of bringing supplies, water, and ammunition up, and the even greater difficulty of carrying the wounded down a pathless precipice 400 feet high, can be better imagined than described. This work had mostly to be done by night, for our communication line was under enemy observation. The last of the ambulance camels, which were evacuating wounded from the regimental aid post, had not crossed the Bullet Ridge and got out of sight before dawn, and were shelled accordingly. The enemy delivered counterattacks again in the night. These also were repulsed. Next morning, he changed his tactics. Continuing to shell the back areas, he now pushed up snipers, who established themselves where they could fire at any movement. Insofar as the snipers near the summit of the ridge were concerned, a service of counter-sniping was established. But, what was more difficult to deal with, he established snipers on the lower slopes of his own side of the ridge, who could look down upon and make themselves unpleasant towards Rafat. Accordingly, it was decided to clear the forward slope. The Dorsets had now been fighting on the hill for 48 hours. Accordingly, on the night of the 10th to 11th, they were relieved by an Indian battalion, the Outrans. Just before dawn, this battalion moved forward, surprised the Turks, drove them down the hill, and consolidated a line along the forward slope with observation posts and Lewis gunners, withdrawing the remainder of the battalion behind the crest. The sniping had thus been stopped for the time, and the day was passed in comparative quiet. At dusk, that evening, down came one of the most furious bombardments put down by the enemy in Palestine. Guns from all quarters concentrated on the hill and practically blotted out the devoted band that were holding the forward line. The bombardment was followed up by a determined counterattack, but this was repulsed, the battalion of Dorsets being brought back to support the Outrans on the hill. It was now realized that the only way by which the Arara position could be captured and held was by a general advance of the line to at least 1,000 yards farther to the north, so as to capture the Pimple, Sheikh Suba, and the enemy works beyond Three Bushes. Accordingly, preparations were put in hand, and all was ready for this further advance when there came the disaster in France. The great German offensive in France had commenced on the 21st March, and, a few days later, occurred that great breakthrough which very nearly altered the whole complexion of the war. At first, this was not allowed to prejudice the operations in Palestine. But, as the seriousness of the situation in France became realized, no effort was spared to collect more men to fill the gap. Orders were given to cease all further active operations on a large scale in Palestine, and to send to France all the men that could be spared. Accordingly, there was no alternative but to consolidate, to heavily wire and sangar in upon the line that had been already reached, making such tactical readjustments as were necessary. It might appear at first sight that the net result of these operations was negative, and that the poor fellows who had given their lives here had died in vain. But this was not so. Rafat was destined to become famous. It was fortified on an almost impregnable scale, thousands of pounds were spent, and a couple of million sandbags were worked into its defences. A veritable fortress was established which overlooked much of the enemy positions. More than once was this fortress attacked by the Turks, but in vain. It ultimately formed the firm pivot on which was based the great sweep which conquered Palestine. Feeling between the Turks and the Germans was growing intensely bitter. Germans were not allowed to walk about singly behind the Turkish lines, for fear of assassination. In an attack made by them in the Jordan Valley in July, not only did the Turks fail to move forward in support of the Germans, but they actually fired upon the Germans when, through lack of that support, they were compelled to retire. It was a case of a house divided against itself, and it could not therefore hope long to stand. Active operations on a large scale in Palestine having been stopped, the army was not reorganized. It was a matter of keen regret to many who had followed the fortunes of this campaign since the days of Gaza, that they and their battalions were not to play a part in the final act. The 52nd and the 74th Divisions were withdrawn entirely, their places being taken by the 3rd and 7th Indian Divisions from Mesopotamia. All those remaining, except the 54th, were converted into Indian divisions, 75% of their battalions being withdrawn and replaced by fresh battalions from India. Those withdrawn were, in some cases, sent to France, in others broken up and used for reinforcements in the country. Hitherto, the army in Palestine had consisted mainly of territorials. Henceforth it was to consist mainly of Indians.
This concludes today's reading of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.